So when I was 9 years old, my dad picked me up from a baseball game, a little league game, and it was raining outside. We were driving home. It was very rainy, and we got hit by a car. Unexpected, shocking, but no one was hurt. It was basically a fender bender, not the craziest deal. And my dad got out of the car. The guy who hit us got out of the car. There was a bit of a confrontational moment. Obviously, cars colliding is stressful. And I remember this moment because in this moment, it was the first time in my life that I saw my dad nervous. Now, I was a kid, I was 9 years old, so I had no idea what was going on in my dad's head. It could have been a lot of things. Truthfully, though, my dad is kind of a nervous person, so maybe it actually had nothing to do with this confrontational moment with another man. Maybe it's just his behavior. But from my 9-year-old lens, I looked at him and I changed my view of him. And in that moment, he no longer was this omnipotent figure that most young children see their parents as. I saw him as human for the first time, and it made me feel very uncomfortable because I do think on some subconscious level, my dog brain was essentially like, "Oh shit, I'm not actually safe." This creature, this other person. If you caught my dog brain episode, I flushed out how our dog brain that's within ourselves, our mammalian limbic system, needs to feel safe through our social hierarchy, right? That's why literal dogs always want to know who the pack alpha is, right? So in my case, my pack alpha, my father, was showing weakness for the first time. He is a human being, but for my child lens, it kind of changed my view of him, right? And I think it triggered various insecurities that we could say is like the birth of my father wound, if you will. And I do look at this time as kind of the time where my relationship with my dad first starts to deteriorate. Maybe because of moments like this, partly also, I had various insecurities as a young man, and I did blame them on my father. I saw my dad was nervous, I was nervous. I took out my anger on him, perhaps unfairly. But I also noticed something deeper, more than just my relationship with my literal dad. It was like I separated on some subconscious level from the feeling of connection to an omnipotent, what we would call the Godhead in psychology, this male presence that has everything handled for me, right? Who takes care of me, who keeps me safe, who gives me guidance, like where I can put full trust in him in the way that most monotheistic religions put full trust in God the Father. So I've noticed this, I've done a lot of episodes on the father wound and male role models and things. But only recently I have been thinking about a different stage in the monomyth, in Joseph Campbell's monomyth, known as Atonement with the Father, where it's not about the separation part, but it's actually about the reconciliation, which, whether it has to do with your literal father or not, although it tends to be represented by your relationship with your primary role model, this is the moment where you get to put yourself back together. And as a new father myself, I think this is what has triggered it in me. Like when my daughter's, it's been about a year since I've been a dad. My daughter turns a year old in a few weeks. I have noticed, one, what every new parent says, which is you become a parent, you start to identify with your actual parents, you empathize with them more, forgive them, all of that stuff, but also kind of a reconnection to a part of myself, a part of my psyche, perhaps a part of my masculinity that I have not touched or I don't even think have come close to since being a kid who looked up to dad. So this stage in Joseph Campbell's monomyth, what we commonly refer to as the hero's journey, atonement with the Father is the stage in the psychological journey where one reconciles with the Godhead, with their omnipotent father figure, which again can be represented by your dad, but honestly, if you're an adult man, your dad is probably an old man and you're probably not seeing him that way. But we see this in our mythologies, right? Some of the most heavy-handed, you can look at Star Wars. The original episodes of Star Wars was basically like Luke's hero's journey. Obviously Star Wars very heavy-handedly followed the monomyth. In episode 1, he's viewing Darth Vader as this evil, omnipotent force, doesn't know it's his father. Episode 4, the next episode, he confronts Darth Vader and he finds out, the iconic line, "Luke, I am your father," and it causes all sorts of anguish because he has to recognize that this thing he's hated, I mean, it represents boy psychology a lot. Like this thing he's hated for an entire episode of episode 4 turns out to be where he comes from, which I think is a deep recognition that men at a certain level of maturity have to come to grips with. And then finally, at the end, episode 6, they reconcile. They have the literal battle. They fight each other. They almost kill each other. They make up in that tear-jerky father-son moment. But I do think this represents something very deep and critical for men, whereas there is a natural separation from your dad. And in fact, in the episode on the 5 stages of the male psyche, which was my personal favorite episode of the podcast last year, I'll put a link in the show notes if you didn't catch it. I do think rebellion is necessary, right? Like you have to rise up against the father, whether it means your literal father or the father within you, in order to create your own unique identity, right? If you stay within your father's house forever, you stay as a boy forever, regardless of your age. But at some point you have to come back. At some point you have to reintegrate the piece that you were born with, the masculinity that was given to you through what Campbell would call your primary father, and the identity that you sought out and created for yourself, which is what Campbell would call secondary father. So in this episode, we're going to talk about this as a return to mythology, which I haven't spoken about too much. Obviously, we're going to speak about Jungian archetypes and all that fun stuff. I'm going to start with some biological or the evolutionary origins of all this stuff to make sure we don't go into mystical land. I'm going to speak about Campbell's ideas of the primary, secondary father, which I've done a whole episode on in the past, but we're going to take it a step further because I actually stopped with the secondary father idea in that episode a few years ago, and then go into actual atonement. Like, what is reconciliation between, the nature's masculinity and nurture's masculinity, both of which is within you. One quick announcement. If you're on my Substack, you probably got this email already, but I'm doing my Masculine Archetype Challenge live starting this Sunday, February 5th. It's what I did when I first launched the program in 2018. I think it's a great program. I actually have wanted to do it again myself. It's a 21-day program to get in touch with what we would call your masculine archetype, your testosterone-driven virtues that are dormant within you. So we're doing a group. I think there's about 20 of us in the group right now starting on Sunday. So if you want to join that, if you want to join the group calls, sign up before Sunday at ruwando.com/archetype. All right, we'll take a sip of water, and then we're going to jump into evolution. All right, so all things within our psyche, what Jung would call archetypes, what we can more commonly refer to as emotional patterns, your sense of whatever, confidence, courage, abstractions like masculinity, all of these modes of behavior have an evolutionary origin. Just a little other plug, my buddy Francis, who I share my office with, we've been starting this like kind of informal book club. We're reading a book called Moral Origins, which is really this idea. So if you want to check that out, that's also going to be a playlist on my YouTube. It's also going to be on Substack. We're breaking down more of the anthropological side of this stuff. But simply what's relevant to us, with atonement to the Father, it comes from our pre-civilization ancestors, where across cultures, this was pretty universal, and therefore we can say it was natural or archetypal, if you will. When a boy reached a certain age, somewhere between age 7-ish and puberty, he'd be taken from his mother, he'd be taken from the land of women, where he and the other kids, regardless of their gender, would all be just treated as children. And that was their social role. The young boy would be taken from the land of women by his father and brought into the land of men through a rite of passage. And then when he came back, regardless of his age, his social role was no longer that of a boy, and now he was a man. I mean, this is what the bar mitzvah is, right? Even though, again, I bring this up every time I bring up rites of passage of bar mitzvahs. No family seriously treats their bar mitzvah 13-year-old as a man, even though you say that. But there was a time in human history, say in Jewish history, where a boy had his bar mitzvah and he actually was treated as a man. Like, he would start to get adult man responsibilities. He would, his standard of conduct would be that of a man and not of a boy anymore. And this, of course, is represented in various, in film, and I'm actually going to, this is maybe an odd reference for a podcast on masculinity, but in the Disney movie Bambi, that movie is actually a little bit about leaving his mother harshly. If you didn't see the movie, Bambi's mother dies, to the point where, most people who haven't seen the film are actually unsure if Bambi's a boy or a girl, because Bambi seems so feminine, but Bambi is a boy. And obviously the name Bambi sounds pretty feminine, but there's that, again, iconic line. I think it's in the end of the movie. I haven't seen it in a long time, obviously, where his father just shows up, right? Like the movie's like, his mother gets shot by a hunter. He's like putting himself back together. It's kind of like an extended leaving the mother, like mother wound type of thing. And then his father shows up. He's a stag. He's king of the forest, and says, I will raise the boy and teach him the ways of the forest. And then it's implied that after the film, Bambi becomes a man, right? This is atonement to the father. This is like a peaceful reconciliation with leaving the comforts of mother, the comforts represented by the archetypal mother, and brought to the tough love of the father, where father loves you, but he's not going to let you slack, because he knows in the harsh world, if he raises you to be weak, that's the worst thing he can do for you, right? So even though our society, modern civilization, doesn't have any of this, right? We don't have rites of passage, the roles that are called traditional gender roles don't really have, for the most part, don't really have a survival basis the way they did for our pre-civilization ancestors. But these emotions are still within us, right? These things still drive us, right? As far as, anything from daddy issues to who we're interested in public figures, be it like a child worshiping a certain basketball player he likes, or whatever, right? All of these drives come from these evolutionary origins. And I was speaking about this I was speaking about this with my buddy Mishka, who's been on the podcast a few times. I don't want to tell too much of his story because he's going to come on maybe in a month and tell it, but he's in the middle of a feminine cleanse right now, which is, he realized he had certain behaviors in validation seeking with women. He wanted to free himself from them. And so he's taking a break from women. And specifically, for him, he's pretty good with women. So it's not about changing how he relates necessarily. I don't want to speak for him, but he's identified that he seeks the feminine for certain levels of comfort that he doesn't want to be reliant on. So he and I were speaking about that. He's taken, I think a month of no dating, etc. But then we were talking about his lifestyle stuff, and I was pointing out that he did have certain comforts in his life, and even though they weren't women, it kind of was almost still the same thing as the archetypal mother. Like he was seeking certain things that made him feel good and feel cozy and maybe feel good about himself and validated and comforted, as most of us, seek when we're feeling not so great. And I was suggesting to him is if you really want to get the most out of this cleanse, maybe you shouldn't seek the metaphorical mother, and you should seek the metaphorical father. What does it mean to seek daddy instead of mommy? Obviously we're speaking about, metaphorically, of course, right? So what does that mean? So instead of maybe doing something that feels good or feels comforting, you do an ice bath. Instead of a hot shower or a hot bath that makes you feel relaxed, that kind of feels like archetypal mother energy, you dump in a cold plunge, right? It's a different kind of thing that takes you out of your problems. It takes you out of your worries, right? It's it's kind of like you go to dad and you're complaining and he smacks you in the face. Not that that's what I would do as a father, but that kind of energy of where I'm not going to let you wallow in this, right? I'm not going to, hold you to my skirt. I'm going to give you something hard to do, and that's going to fix you. That's going to help you. And Mishka and I, he'll come on the podcast and we'll talk about his experience more, but we were kind of brainstorming, what are these kinds of things, right? Like ice instead of hot showers, from a plant perspective, tobacco instead of weed. Not that I'm a proponent of tobacco, but there are a lot of studies coming out about how tobacco raises testosterone, which I just think is interesting. Obviously, I wouldn't suggest smoking tobacco for the net health benefits, but tobacco obviously has been associated with men, cigars and whatnot, and I actually have been starting smoking a pipe occasionally since becoming a dad. It actually feels a lot better than smoking weed, which does feel like kind of getting a little bit too loose. And we do know also that cannabis does feminize you, both in terms of behavior and biologically. And then other things, right? What is the thing that the benevolent father who loves you, but is also holding you to a standard of strength, what would he do for you? Which is an internal inquiry when it comes to atonement. So now let's go into the primary and secondary father idea, because this is a really critical idea from Joseph Campbell that obviously is very pertinent to men, whereas there is the imprint of masculinity you've been given that you have no choice over, right? This is your primary father. This is your biological dad and or the men who raised you, who you did not get to choose, right? So if you're raised by your biological father, that's him, right? He represents it. But archetypally, it could be spread out over many men, right? Maybe you had a stepdad, maybe an uncle was very present in your life, grandpa, whatever. But you didn't choose them, right? They just showed up in your life, or they were there when you were born, or their DNA is within you, and this is where you got your first imprints of nature and early nurture for being a man, whether you like it or not. I'm sure there's positive traits and negative traits that came with that. And the secondary father is the one you didn't choose. We'll talk about that next. So in antiquity, which I'll define as early civilization, where society and culture was still close enough to nature, like close enough to that older tribal society where a lot of the cultural norms reflected that, as we can see in most ancient civilizations. In antiquity, especially in an area, in a society where there was danger and therefore men had to be strong. You think of anywhere where there's an honor culture, where there wasn't a state providing the security for everyone. Men were often introduced by who their father was, right? You see this, if you catch my History of Men podcast, I just released an episode on the Peloponnesian Wars. So I've read a lot of Greek history recently. And if you read any of the Greek historians, Thucydides, Herodotus, Xenophon, anytime they're introducing a new leader, a new significant man, they always mention who his father was. Like, this is Cimon, son of Miltiades, who did this and this at Marathon. And it's to give credibility to the guy who you don't know, because in a society back then, you can't just look someone up online, right? So if a new man is on the scene, he's too young to have done any heroic feats to be known, to have his own reputation. In the beginning, it's his father's reputation that kind of seeds his place in society. It's like he relies on, like, oh, I'm whatever, son of Jochi, and like maybe you don't know who this guy is, but you meet him on the roads in the Asian steppes, and you're riding a horse, and this young warrior comes along, and he says, "Oh, I'm so and so, son of Xochi." It's like, well, I never heard of you, but I've heard of your father. He's an honorable warlord. Okay, assuming that you're the right person. Okay, we can travel together because I know you're not going to rob me in my sleep. I know if shit goes down, I can count on you because I know what your father's reputation is. And you even see this in in fiction, in fantasy, right? Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, J.R.R. Tolkien, and George R.R. Martin obviously read a lot of history, which is one thing that's so interesting about their fantasy world. It's like it has the realism of even though it's a fantasy world, the relationships are very real because a lot of them are based on history. And in Lord of the Rings, when Aragorn is introduced, or when he introduces himself, when he's like hiding as a ranger, he says, "I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn, son of Isildur," right? He's pointing to his lineage as his credibility because no one knows who he is. In that sense, the father's reputation provides the son's spiritual perimeter, right? In the sense that, if someone wants to know what this young man is about, they just assume he's taken on the intangible qualities of his father. So there's that. The second piece, though, is the material perimeter, right? The reason why people's last names come from their father in almost pretty much every culture, except maybe in the modern, more liberal settings, is your surname denotes who has your back, right? If you are, and this is why so many surnames literally are who your father is. Like Leif Erikson means son of Eric the Red. So you meet Leif Erikson, you've heard of his father. It's like, okay, he must be cool too. I'm going to follow him. But also, if I mess with Leif Erikson, I have to answer to the war band of Eric the Red. It gives you that backing. And obviously, not all last names literally say who your father is, although many European last names, a lot of the suffixes, say in Slavic names, like Vich means son of Milosevic, son of Milo, etc. Whatever your last name is, the origin, whether it's your clan or your caste or your profession, your family's profession, it represents who has got your back if someone were to mess with you, right? And this is why the symbolism of a woman marrying a man and taking his family name, it used to really mean something, right? Because it meant that a young woman was going from the perimeter of her father, the house of her father, to the house of her husband. So if Mary Johnson became Mary Hatfield, if someone messes with Mary, now they have to answer to Mr. Hatfield. That's kind of, obviously feminists have turned this into like it being like property, which I don't think was the initial intention, because this cultural norm became a thing because people needed security. In our modern day states, personal security is very low, which is why, truthfully, these kind of what we call patriarchal norms maybe aren't that necessary anymore, but they have real roots. Anyways, this is why the primary father was so critical in both in pre-civilization and early civilization. And even though it's becoming less and less important in our modern day state, none of us carry around weapons. None of us need, it doesn't matter what your father's reputation is anymore. Like every generation is kind of separate from each other as far as societal reputation goes. These emotions are still within us, right? Because we evolved for a different world. Now, the secondary father. Secondary father is the male role model or role models you've chosen on your own, right? The primary is the one that you were given. The secondary father is the one that you've chosen, in a sense, to complete your unique identity. I mentioned this earlier, and I talked about it in the 5 stages of the male psyche episode. But this is a critical stage, and it's represented in a lot of mythologies through rebellion and in many people's real lives. If you were an angsty teenager and you fought with your dad, maybe for reasons that you look back on, I was like, well, that was kind of silly of both of us to be mad about. Maybe the issues were silly, or maybe they weren't, or maybe the things you were angry about were very legitimate. But this stage of somehow rising up against the father, maybe not your literal father, but often is represented this way, is a very critical stage, right? Because again, I mentioned this, but a man who doesn't in some way separate himself from the father, as seen in the prodigal son parable in the Bible, he never creates his own identity. He stays within the house of his father. And I've mentioned this in a few episodes, but I have a few friends who have really awesome dads. Like I have a few friends who like their dads are like kind of famous and super well known and super alpha and super awesome and great guys. And their sons, who are my age, they're in their 30s, still worship their dad to the degree that they've never left their father's shadow. And I can see that almost has as negative an effect as having a father who wasn't strong, right? It's like they never really found themselves, unfortunately. So this rebellion is necessary. And it's actually one of the exercises in my Masculine Archetype Challenge, which is to inventory in yourself, what are the things or the types of men you've been drawn to, or types of activities even you've been drawn to inexplicably, right? Like it's one thing to love baseball because your dad loved baseball and your neighbors love baseball and all the guys, that we can say, okay, that was taken from your environment or your religious beliefs or whatever. Like if it's the same thing as your environment, then probably you got it from your environment, right? Like most of us aren't that independent in our thought. But if you have certain interests or proclivities or beliefs or ideas that seem to have come from nowhere, like, maybe they're even opposite what your parents or your upbringing was into, that I think is very interesting, because we can almost say like, one, this is like your unique self that didn't come from nurture. But I also believe that when it comes to like, say, male role models that one seeks, it shows what you've been lacking. It's like the secondary father represents kind of a correction, right? So, obviously Andrew Tate is in the news a lot. People have opinions. He's very polarizing. I have my own opinions, of course, but simply the fact that he's become so popular lately, especially with young men, points to how collectively men, say of Generation Z, have been lacking what he's giving, right? The brashness, all the stuff, the money, the sex, the things that the unapologetic things that he says, regardless of what we think of him, it does demonstrate, his popularity demonstrates that this has been lacking in many men, right? That's why they seek him as a secondary father, essentially, which, not to say that people are necessarily looking at him as a father figure or, the people that you listen to or are drawn to, not that you're looking at them as daddy, but you are looking at them as a male role model to maybe complete something or to absorb a trait that you consciously or subconsciously feel you were lacking in. And I think specifically with young men, as seen with Andrew Tate, but also with every generation, it's pretty common that teenage boys are drawn to what we could call dark masculine archetypes, right? The Tony Montana's, organized crime becomes very interesting, or gang behavior becomes very interesting when you're a pubescent male, and like you suddenly have this surge of testosterone, and you're somehow separating from your primary upbringing, and you're seeking strong male role models who complete you. In fact, this is often pointed out with gang membership, that it's fatherless boys that are most drawn to that, right? Because they're missing an alpha male in their home tribe, so they join this pack of alphas, seeming alphas, or truly alphas in a gang. Tyler Durden is another example in Fight Club, etc. And I think these unconscious drives represent a correction. So if you're on my Substack, you may have seen I reposted an article on sexual archetypes called "The Devil's Inside of Us." And one of my arguments in that article is that the same thing with our sexual desires, right? Like when you have like this inexplicable sexual desire, very often it's a correction against something in your upbringing. So one example is like racial stuff, like jungle fever, for instance. The trope with that is that it is, it's a popular term in the 70s, that it was specifically white men who were either racist themselves or raised in a racist culture that seemed to fetishize Black women's sexuality, right? Why is that? Because their culture is saying, okay, don't look at this type of woman, it's not good for you. Whereas their nature is like, what are you talking about? A beautiful, fertile woman is a beautiful, fertile woman. So this fetish comes in to correct the fact they're pushing it away. It's essentially what you resist persists unconsciously, right? Like you try not to think of something, but your unconscious wants you to think of that thing. Your unconscious wants you to procreate. Your unconscious wants you to be a complete male that integrates all the different traits. If you, for whatever reason, you've been pushing something away, the secondary father interest or these inexplicable drives pull you in. Another obvious example is like the whole trope about like the homophobic politician who then comes out with some scandal of him like having sex with a boy or something, right? And very often the cultural narrative, the common narrative is like, oh, this person, he was a closet gay and he wasn't right with it. So, he became homophobic publicly. I actually think potentially the causality is reversed, where it is that this person learns to hate something so hard and so, unnecessarily that his unconscious, which doesn't have any reason to hate things, comes in to like undo the hatred with sexual desire. So I actually think in some ways homophobics turn themselves gay or turn themselves interested in that kind of stuff because they're fighting it so hard. What you resist persists, right? Like your unconscious doesn't discriminate against things that think that things, right? It just is. So the secondary father, again, these unconscious drives, they represent a correction. I think looking at this is a very interesting exercise. Like in myself, I've noticed my main inexplicable interest that has lasted my whole life has been an obsession with combat sports, which doesn't make sense because my parents are kind of hate that stuff. Nobody I grew up around was into boxing or anything, but for some reason, even as a 4-year-old, like the first time I saw boxing, I was obsessed with it. And looking backwards and connecting dots, it's like, well, my dad is a super pacifist, like he's a vegetarian, he's a true Buddhist, like he really lives by like the precepts of like he won't kill a bug kind of thing, which is nothing wrong with that. And I actually, as a father now, I do appreciate his gentleness more. But something in my unconscious was like, wait a minute, we need to integrate aggression also. So I kind of became obsessed with it, I think, right? A little bit of self-analysis. So the secondary father completes your identity, but you can't stop there. And actually, in the previous episode I did specifically on the secondary father, I think I stopped there because that is part of the stage, right? In the monomyth, it's the meeting of the mentor. It's like meeting Obi-Wan, who teaches you the Jedi tricks that you wanted to learn, but your father wasn't around to teach you because your father's Darth Vader, or whomever, right? Whomever the mentor is. There is still another stage because if you stop here, then these parts of yourself, these parts of your masculinity, you can say, are still at odds, right? There's the good side from Obi-Wan, the light side, but the darkness that your father, actually a fun fact I learned recently, the word for father in Dutch, my wife is Dutch, so I'm learning random words, is vader, is Vader. Like literally in Dutch, Darth Vader is Darth Father, which again, very heavy-handed by George Lucas, but essentially, if you don't have this moment, this next stage of atonement with the Father, and this is why it's later in the monomyth, is that you end up having this inner turmoil. And you see this, and I've seen this a lot in men who maybe sought the opposite of their father because they didn't like their dad. Maybe their dad was an angry alcoholic or hyper dominant in a totally unempathic way. So they grew up with nice guy syndrome, right? They don't want to be harsh to women the way their father was. So they go through life totally repressing all of their dominance and aggression and assertiveness, and they end up as impotent guys. Or the other way around. Maybe your dad was a pacifist and you walk around with a chip on your shoulder. Or your dad was one way. And it's like maybe you sought this completion, but you haven't integrated it. So there's still this inner turmoil. Hence, the atonement is so important because, if your primary father is your thesis, secondary father is the antithesis, you do need to synthesize at some point, which is why atonement with the Father is related to apotheosis, essentially becoming a God yourself in the sense of seeing your dad as a God, you become the Father as well. And I do think it's a completion that obviously I'm going through now as a young father, although I think it applies to all men, especially if you've gone past the phase of, say, the rebellion. Because, and this is represented in films like, The Lion King. I'm thinking Disney because I downloaded a bunch of Disney movies to watch with my kid. But in The Lion King, when Simba speaks to his father in the sky and Rafiki says, "Your father lives in you," this is one of the realizations, right? This is why it happens later in the movie, right before the final battle. It's like this is where the hero gets his power of synthesizing his primary father elements and secondary father elements, because as Rafiki said, whether you like it or not, your primary father is in you. Your biological dad's DNA, half of your DNA came from him, right? So a lot of your physical traits and behavioral characteristics, whether you like it or not, whether you like him or not, you have in common with him. I guess it's to say it's yours that come from him, or it's his that he gave to you, or really, all of those traits, obviously your DNA, but a lot of the traits that come with it, even traits passed on through nurture, they come from a whole lineage of, ancestors going way further back than you can imagine. So I think it's natural and understandable that a teenager who's dealing with shit and realizes he's got this complex, maybe from his dad, you have your dad was this way, so now you're this way, and you blame him for it. Well, he got it from somewhere too. He got it from maybe his grandfather or his upbringing, and it goes all the way back. And I think this is part of the maturity of recognizing that a lot of who you are, especially your masculinity, is impersonal, right? It belongs to your family more than it belongs to you. It belongs to your lineage, if you will. So can you blame any node? Can you blame any one person in the chain? Well, maybe if they made it worse, right? Maybe if they blew the family fortune after inheriting, and I mean that like metaphorically, they inherited a bunch of positive traits and they didn't pass them on. Okay, maybe, but chances are, unless your dad or your parents really fucked up what your grandparents gave them, in terms of traits, but maybe money as well. Really, it belongs to no one, right? Your masculinity is not really yours. In fact, most of your traits are not necessarily yours. You might seek out certain things as one node in this chain through your contributions by bringing in elements from your personal secondary father, but a lot of it comes from somewhere else. I think this recognition provides a lot of peace, at least it does in me. And, every new father says this, but the more, as I have identified with the father role, it's impossible not to forgive my dad for all this shit that I blamed him for, because I'm like, well, I'm dealing with it too, right? He didn't mean to pass on insecurities to me, he just did. And even though, it's one thing to just believe in the idea, the spiritual cliche of forgiveness, is another thing to not be able to not feel forgiveness because you're experiencing it too. So I have found that recognizing my place in the chain very simply is part of the atonement. And I just recorded an episode with my buddy Noel Free on ancestral wounds in kind of a different context. He was speaking about like certain behavioral patterns that, him and his siblings got from his parents and their parents got from him. And he's kind of the person in his family who's like the most conscious, if you will. And he's kind of fixed the problem. He's like fixed the link. He was the link that kind of fixed their social dynamics in a sense. It's a good episode. You can check it out. Maybe in a couple of weeks it'll be out. But this kind of recognition can't not give you a sense of peace, right? And what this really is, I mean, part of this also, part of this could be making peace with your literal dad, especially if you had an issue with your primary father, your primary male role models. I do think that comes with it. And as I've integrated this within myself, I've noticed that my relationship with my dad has gotten better. But what I think is more pertinent than, just that is the connection to the father figure, the father archetype or the Godhead within yourself. Because that initial moment that I was speaking about, that in my memory at least, that 9-year-old moment where I saw my dad kind of get dominated, and I felt I felt this disappointment and these dog brain fears and this separation. At some point, you want to reconnect with that, right? I think the rebellion, the separation is important, but at some point you come home, as represented by the prodigal son story in the Bible, right? The young son doesn't want to take over the family business. He says, fuck off, dad. He goes off into the wilderness trying to make it on his own. He fails. Then he comes back to his father's home and he's celebrated, which is a kind of a confusing story for many of us because there's another son who stayed, who was like the good boy. He stayed and he's not celebrated. He's like, well, I was the one who stayed. And the lesson, at least the one that I've taken or believe to be a useful interpretation, is that the prodigal son was celebrated because he actually left and he chose to come back, right? He didn't stay out of fear. He didn't stay out of obligation. He did his own thing, and of his own volition, he came back. And I think this represents something very important within us, because while, again, your relationship with your dad can represent this thing in you, and I do think, another exercise in my archetype challenge is what I call relationship mapping, where you recognize what your significant relationships might represent in your own psyche. So maybe your dad represents your relationship to money, and your ex-girlfriend represents like really being vulnerable, and these things have kind of stuck. And in some ways you can, by working on the external relationship, you can work your internal relationship. I do think there is a high correlation there. Even if your father's not around, or even if you never really had an issue with your literal father, this reintegration, this atonement with the Godhead, I think is relevant to everyone. Because if we look at it from a spiritual lens for a moment, I do think this is one of the reasons why monotheistic religions really became a thing, right? Because especially, and they weren't a thing pre-civilization. Pre-civilization religions tended to be a little bit more matriarchal or egalitarian or polytheistic, where there's many gods. But I think specifically when society evolved and became more defined, the hierarchies of society became more defined, specifically for the men who were in charge of things, whether they were in charge, head of a state or head of a family, or had to protect their crop or something. It's these men specifically, men we can call the perimeter setters, or loosely call the alphas, who like this idea of God the Father in the sky became really appealing. And I am, inputting my own experience, because I have noticed as I've become a father, this idea, I was raised Catholic, but I rejected it at a young age. This idea of like a God in the sky who I can always count on, who like can give me guidance, who I could give full trust in as I provide that for my children, that seems really appealing. Honestly, for the first time in my life, it was like, yeah, it would be cool to have a God, like a father above me who can tell me how to father everyone else, right? And I do think this is part of why those religious memes became so popular and as they spread. I'm actually going to be doing a whole series on monotheism on the History of Man podcast, probably later this year, because I have a lot more books to read on it. But essentially, the takeaway here for atonement in yourself is to recognize, or to even believe, right? Even if you're not, obviously I'm not pushing any religion, but to choose to believe or choose to perceive something that you can treat as a father that's bigger than you. In the same way that when you were a little boy, you looked at your primary male role model in some way as omnipotent, right? This is the root of this is the evolutionary root of the idea of the Godhead, right? There is a father who can handle all the shit, right? He can give you advice, he can keep you safe, he can provide all those things, and seeking something like that, right? So if you're religious, you can seek that, right? But if not, and it is, you kind of have to create your own religion in a sense of like choosing abstract values or choosing a morality or choosing some code that you're going to rely on in place of a literal man telling you what to do, right? I mean, this is why so many things, whether it's 12-step recovery or the Freemasons, like they all require someone to believe in a higher power, because it gives people, specifically men who are in charge of shit, it gives them a sense of security and peace, which allows them to be the perimeter setter for others. It allows you to be a better alpha, if you will, because then you're not on your own, right? People, I mean, this is dog brain stuff, and I think this is more true for males across the animal kingdom, including humans, is that we don't want to be at the top of the hierarchy. We want to be in a hierarchy, and obviously males compete for highest status, but to be at the very top is very stressful, right? It feels better to know what's above you and what's below you, which is why, dogs who only have a dog brain or don't have a rational brain, the first thing they do, especially male dogs when they meet, is immediately determine the order. Once they know the order, they have peace. And I spoke about this more in the dog brain episode. But this gives us a sense of security and peace that allows us to provide for others, because otherwise you're at the top of the pyramid and there's nothing above you, and it becomes there's like on a primal mammalian level, it gives you a sense of unease, which is why, and I bring this idea up all the time, because I think it's so such a vivid image of that. There's the trope of the high power CEO or the high power finance guy who's like super alpha in charge of everything, Those are the ones who seem to be the primary customer of dominatrixes. I mean, I had a few dominatrix friends in New York City, like tiny little women who would get paid lots of money to whip guys and humiliate them. It was typically the gigachats essentially who hired them. Seems weird, but from from this kind of unconscious drive perspective, they were seeking correction, right? Like a man who's the boss when it comes to everything 100% of the time, people are worshiping him. He's like truly the king of his reality. If he's not religious, it feels very uncomfortable to be at the very top, right? He wants something to humble him. And if, a lot of men will seek Christianity or Islam or some monotheistic religion for that purpose, but they don't have God. They then hire a little Asian woman to stomp on them and call them names, because at least they can become humble to something. They can experience that humiliation as a correction, and it makes them feel better about themselves. And the final piece about this atonement, that goes along with recognizing your place in the chain, is coming to terms with the fact that a lot of your traits, a lot of your sense of masculinity came from your primary father, whether you like it or not. Hopefully you've sought mentors in the secondary father experience that fill out the imbalances, but then you have to put them together and refine what you've been given. And one example, which means, accepting and using the positives that your father gave you, and maybe correcting and refining and integrating the things that maybe weren't so great. So one example from one of my coaching clients, he's a pro athlete. He originally hired me to speak about his marriage stuff, but then we kind of resolved his marriage issues pretty quickly. And we started talking about his career, because he's very talented, he's very athletic, but he's, he hasn't achieved what he thinks he should achieve based on how good he is in practice, essentially. And we're talking about like what could be, obviously I'm not a sports coach, but we were looking into that stuff. And he shared that his father was also a professional athlete in his sport. And his father kind of, reduced his, kind of blew his chances at a career at it, because he couldn't control his emotions. Like he would get very angry. Like he would be a little bit too emotional and it would mess up his game. And then, this client of mine, obviously a younger man, he's been playing this sport with his dad for a long time, but he specifically always tried to suppress his emotions in this part of the game, or like he didn't exercise like his passion, or he doesn't as much, I think on some level, because he doesn't want to be his dad, right? He doesn't want to be the person who has an angry outburst on the court. But I would say, like, you're kind of, I mean, this is in you. Like, this is kind of a superpower your father gave you that you haven't integrated, that you could use. You could refine it and turn it into something, we look at some of the, the biggest athletes, Jordan, and if you caught the Last Dance, it was the Last Dance documentary, great nostalgia berries if you grew up in the 90s. He was kind of a dick, right? But he was so passionate, so driven. I was trying to see, how can you integrate this in yourself so you're not rejecting what your father gave you? You realize the way he did it was wrong, but you can integrate it in a way that is useful for you. And we've been exploring on how to integrate that. And I recognize in myself that, okay, maybe my dad didn't, he was lacking in certain areas, right? Maybe he wasn't the most assertive. There's certain things, but obviously my secondary father journey has been seeking out these traits to bring them into myself, but also recognizing that my dad gave me a lot of things that are useful. In fact, my dad is still alive. He's, kind of he was a physics professor. He's kind of like that kind of nervous intellectual energy. Here I am having a podcast. I have a career where I talk about things that I find interesting, a lot of the times academic. I definitely got that from my dad. Ironically, the stuff I talk about, I got from my secondary father journey. But, this kind of integration is how could I not appreciate that? And it's not about, platitudely, I don't know if that's a word, but platitudely, forgiving your father for the sake of it. But if you've gone on your journey, if you've actually separated, if you've done your metaphorical rebellion, sought the secondary father, maybe you've gone through the prodigal son journey of returning home, at some point, if you've really done what you have to do, the only thing that is left to feel is forgiveness, right? It's not about forgiveness for, positive, altruistic, moral reasons. It's forgiveness of oh, if I can forgive this is true for everything regarding forgiveness. If I can really forgive this person I was upset with, then this pain has actually been healed, right? The father wound has been healed. This has been complete. And this is essentially what the king archetype is. And I do believe that to really embody the king, which I define as the archetype of masculinity or the expression of masculinity, where you are not necessarily about yourself, you're about providing the perimeter for dependence. You are, essentially protector of the realm, which is what a king traditionally was. In order to do that, you have to make peace with the Godhead, which again, represented by your boyhood relationship to your father, but it's more than that, right? So finally, I have noticed that as I've been going through this inquiry, as I've been making peace with this father nature within myself, which has bled out into positive interactions with my literal dad, I've been thinking a lot about my boyhood self. I've been thinking a lot about that 9-year-old boy of myself who felt in a way abandoned by the Godhead, right? Recognizing my dad was mortal, recognizing that he was imperfect and had shortcomings and stuff, that father wound. I've been thinking a lot about that, even more than about my dad. I've been thinking about the boy in me that felt that initial wound, that had to go on a journey to try to complete these things. And it feels, I hope this doesn't sound corny, but this is genuine. And it does feel like a completion of something, right? In the monomyth, the hero's journey represents a psychological experience, which is why it is moving to see that story told in films and whatever, or books or whatever. It represents, I think, I do think the monomyth, the hero's journey as we look at it, really is a male's hero's journey. I won't rant on this, but I'll just leave it at that. The atonement with the father occurs towards the end, before the final battle, before the great victory, the Apotheosis experience, where he's integrated all his superpowers, and then he comes home to peace. And I have felt like, in a sense, I've completed a certain journey that started with disappointment as a 9-year-old boy. Excuse the noise. I haven't soundproofed my office, and there's a lot of, here in Mexico, they still advertise like that. So I don't know if you can hear that. So, last point. If you're not religious, if you're, maybe the abstract values of having a code that's not enough, something a little less abstract and more real, which I was chatting with Mishka, was seeking the visceral experience of the father. What is, you have to use your poetic muscles a little bit. But what does it mean to really feel the Father in you? And this is a lot of what people experience when they have spiritual experiences. I think especially with nature, Wim Hof talks about this a lot. Like his teacher is hard nature, right? He goes into the freezing cold, and the freezing cold forces him to not think about bullshit, right? I mean, I do think ice is representative of the Father archetype, or the Godhead even. Because if you've ever gone out into the world, maybe if you've never had an ice bath, if you've ever, I have this experience when I go hiking, I see a giant mountain where you can't help feeling this sense of awe that there is something much bigger than you and way more powerful than you that will always be there. It has a certain comforting feeling, the way I think a boy looks at his father, right? In fact, we can say, to flip the direction of the metaphor, if you will, that one's father, or the way one looks at his father when he's a little boy, is really the Father is standing in as a representation of all of nature, like that sense of awe, of like, wow, that thing that's beyond me can do so much more, and I can do my best to try to embody it, but I'll never do that, right? Like God the Father in the sky is kind of this asymptote, which you can never really, we can try to, a Christian can try to act as his father does, or whatever the Bible says, but you're never going to fully embody it. But there is something to that. And I think as far as like a way to live life, maybe to access the benefits of a religion without being religious, there is that, right? Putting yourself in real situations where you can't help but be in awe. And I'll say for myself, who, I mean, I do live on a mountain, but I don't go hiking maybe as often as would be good for me. I do seek that in working out, where like, if I'm feeling shit, there is always a temptation to seek mommy, to maybe, get high or drink some beers or veg out or do something comforting. And not to say that never is okay, or that's never the right move in a certain context. But what really makes me feel good, in the sense that I can do more shit and handle more things and uphold my responsibilities to my dependence, is something like, doing rounds on the heavy bag until I enter an altered state of consciousness. That endorphin rush, right? Deadlifting until I really feel high of like, oh, what was that bullshit I was worrying about? I don't know. I mean, that to me feels like dad just smacking you in the head, do some push-ups and like, oh yeah, okay, we feel better. So anyways, the Father archetype, hope this has been useful. Yeah, I'll just say my announcements this Saturday, this Sunday, in 3 days, going through the Masculine Archetype Challenge with a live group. So, and I've had this program up for many years. It's one of the things I'm very proud of. I want to go through it myself again. So basically, anyone who signs up before Sunday can join the group call. The group calls, they're added bonus, but they're free. It's February 5th in the afternoon, American time. We're going to do a group call. Should be a lot of fun. If you don't know, the 21-day Archetype Challenge is a 21-day set of missions and lessons that help you get in touch with your testosterone-driven instincts that I would call the Masculine Archetype. That's at ruwando.com/archetype. And it still comes with a free coaching call with me. Yeah. And also, if you're happen to be on YouTube, this is my first time live streaming in like 2 years since I got off visual media. So I'll leave the live stream up for a bit. I'm probably going to live stream every other week, if not every week. But an edited version of this video will be up on my YouTube soon. Also, check out my YouTube. My only subscribers are from more than 2 years ago, because the channel's been down, but I will be posting more videos, more short clips, and obviously the video version of all of my podcast episodes. Thanks for listening. Please like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff if you enjoyed this episode. Goodbye.